When the elderly man limped into the karate class, the younger students couldn't help but laugh. His slow, deliberate movements and worn-out shoes seemed to belong in a different era. But when he tied a frayed black belt around his waist, the atmosphere shifted. This was no ordinary man. His name was Henry Marsh, a 74-year-old with a past that spoke of discipline, precision, and a life spent mastering the martial arts. As he stepped forward and effortlessly kicked the target with perfect balance, the entire room went silent. The mocking smirks turned to awe, and the students, including a cocky young man named Mark, who had earlier sneered, were now forced to respect the man who had barely uttered a word. Henry didn't seek attention. His movements were smooth, like water flowing, and every action was purposeful. He didn't respond to the taunts, but he guided a new student, Lucy, with quiet patience, helping her improve her stance. His teaching was subtle yet impactful, showing not just technique but the importance of control and calmness. As the class progressed, Mark, realizing his own shortcomings, approached Henry, asking for a real challenge. The sparring session that followed was no match. As Henry moved with ease, his every block and strike teaching marked the importance of calm over brute strength. When class ended, Henry, with a small nod of approval, left, leaving behind more than just martial arts techniques. He imparted wisdom that would last a lifetime. When 74-year-old Henry Marsh stepped into the karate class, he didn't attract attention right away. His limp, slow gait, and bony frame were a stark contrast to the vibrant group of younger, stronger students. At first, a few of them, including the cocky 19-year-old Mark, exchanged skeptical glances. It was easy to assume Henry didn't belong in this fast-paced setting, where everyone was either practicing punches or stretching in preparation for the next round of drills. Henry's appearance, worn-out windbreaker, thick glasses slipping down his nose, and cane jingling with his keys, seemed out of place. Mark even whispered a comment about him being there for a Tai Chi class rather than karate, which brought a ripple of laughter. The instructor, Jake Mendez, greeted Henry with a quiet wave and carried on with the lesson, not expecting any disruption. Henry, however, was not here to disrupt. With quiet determination, he positioned himself in the back corner of the room and began to observe the class, his eyes scanning every movement. He didn't react to the laughter or the curiosity around him. Instead, he simply tied a worn black belt around his waist, its edges frayed with years of use. And then, without warning, he performed a front kick, sharp and dead on, hitting the foam target with perfect precision. It was a moment of quiet intensity that caused the room to pause. Even Jake blinked in stunned silence. No one expected that from the frail old man. And for a brief second, the class stood frozen, unsure of how to process what had just happened. But that wasn't the end of the transformation. As the session continued, Henry remained calm and composed, moving through the drills with smooth, fluid motions. He wasn't trying to show off or gain anyone's respect. He simply moved with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience. Mark, still snickering at first, quickly began to see that Henry wasn't just some old man. He was a seasoned martial artist. Despite his stiff joints and his struggle to keep up with the younger, more agile students, Henry didn't falter. His presence alone started shifting the mood of the room. As the class progressed, Henry's calm approach to the practice started to have an effect on the others. The students who had previously dismissed him now looked up to him, paying attention to every precise movement he made. Mark, who had laughed at first, became increasingly frustrated as his own movements began to falter. He had underestimated Henry, and it was clear that Henry's knowledge of martial arts went beyond just physical strength. It was about precision, control, and a deep understanding of the mind-body connection. Henry's subtle guidance didn't go unnoticed. He quietly walked over to Lucy, a newer student who was struggling with her posture, and offered her a tip about pressing her back heel down for better balance. She listened, tried again, and immediately saw improvement. There was no boasting from Henry. No dramatic explanations. He simply shared his wisdom, allowing others to improve without making them feel inferior. In contrast, Mark's loud and cocky attitude continued to falter, with his footwork becoming increasingly sloppy. The frustration grew, but Henry wasn't there to fight him. He simply observed and let the young man work through his own struggles. After a light sparring session between Henry and Mark, it became clear who had the greater skill. Mark had come in with an aggressive mindset, eager to prove himself, but Henry's calm, methodical movements rendered Mark's hasty attacks ineffective. As the sparring match ended, Mark, embarrassed, stormed off to the bench, muttering under his breath, but Henry remained unaffected, his presence still commanding respect. He didn't need to react or engage in a power struggle. His actions spoke for themselves. At the end of the session, Henry's quiet wisdom left a lasting impact. Mark, now humbled, approached Henry and asked if he could train with him outside of class. Henry's calm response was, "You want to learn or you want to win?" Mark nodded, understanding the difference now. As the class ended, Bryn, another student who had admired Henry's calm, asked him why he had stopped teaching years ago. Henry's response was filled with personal history and pain. He had lost a student to violence, a young man named Rico who had been like a son to him. He blamed himself for not teaching him enough, for not preparing him to defend himself in a dangerous world. But over time, Henry realized that he had done what he could. Sometimes, the true lessons weren't about the physical techniques. They were about the emotional and mental resilience to navigate life. The next week, when Henry returned to the dojo, things had changed. His presence was no longer a novelty, it was a source of respect. Mark, now less arrogant, trained with focus and humility. Bryn, inspired by his teaching, was starting to understand the deeper lessons martial arts had to offer. Henry's simple acts of teaching, of sharing his knowledge and experience, had created an atmosphere of growth. His quiet guidance became a reminder that strength isn't just about physical prowess, but about emotional control, resilience, and the ability to let go when the time is right. Through his own struggles and experiences, Henry had come to understand that teaching was not just about instructing others in martial arts. It was about sharing the wisdom gained from life's hardships. It was about helping others find their own path, not just through technique but through the mindset and humility that true strength required. And as the class continued, Henry knew that this was the legacy he had to pass on, not just the moves, but the mindset behind them. The real lesson was not in the black belt, but in the journey it took to earn it. The quiet but powerful presence of the elderly man in karate class had a profound impact on everyone around him. When George Thompson, a 74-year-old with a slight limp, entered the dojo that Tuesday night, the younger students couldn't help but stare, exchanging glances and whispering among themselves. George walked in without fanfare, his worn windbreaker and glasses slipping down his nose, completely unaware of the stir he caused. A few of the younger students, full of energy and cocky confidence, snickered, making jokes under their breath. It didn't take long for their attitude to shift, though. George was here to prove something, not with words, but with quiet actions. The instructor, Jake, had been leading the beginners class for months, but even he couldn't ignore the sudden change in the room when George tied a faded black belt around his waist. It was the simple act of securing that belt, frayed from years of use, that signaled a shift in the atmosphere. The moment George stepped forward to execute a basic kick, the room fell silent. The precision of his movements and the ease with which he hit the target stunned everyone, including Jake. George wasn't flashy. His style wasn't about showmanship. His movements were sharp, calculated, and effortless, like someone who had mastered the art through years of practice and dedication. One young student, Mark, who had been particularly vocal in his mocking earlier, couldn't help but watch in awe as George moved. For a moment, he stood still, realizing that this older man wasn't just a figure from the past. He was a living example of everything the martial arts represented: discipline, patience, and control. George didn't react to the snide comments or the laughter that had rippled through the class. Instead, he focused on his own practice, moving through the forms with a calmness that was contagious. Even those who had dismissed him earlier began to respect him, not for the belt he wore or his age, but for the quiet authority he exuded through every motion. But it wasn't just about the kicks or the punches. George's impact extended beyond the physical demonstration. When he noticed Bryn, a new student struggling with her posture, he didn't criticize or lecture. Instead, he gently guided her, crouching down with great effort despite his stiff joints, to correct her foot placement. His attention to detail and willingness to help even the most beginner students showed his deep understanding of martial arts, not just as a set of moves, but as a way to improve and grow as a person. Bryn, who had felt discouraged, found a new sense of confidence with George's quiet guidance. Despite the admiration he'd earned, not everyone was ready to respect him just yet. Mark, still feeling embarrassed after his earlier outbursts, taunted George once more, challenging him to a sparring match. George didn't hesitate to accept. Instead of reacting with anger or pride, George calmly walked to the center of the mat, unbothered by Mark's cocky attitude. The match wasn't about proving who was better, it was about control. Mark came at him with speed and intensity, throwing wild punches, but George deflected each one with ease, guiding Mark's energy with simple blocks and sidesteps. When Mark's frustration grew, George remained composed, his breathing steady, his movements as smooth as water. It was clear that George wasn't just faster or stronger, he was calm. And that calmness allowed him to maintain control over the situation. After the sparring session, the class continued in a silence that hadn't been there before. Everyone had witnessed George's quiet strength, and the atmosphere had shifted. Even the most vocal students, like Mark, couldn't help but reflect on the lesson they had just received. George didn't need to talk, boast, or prove anything. He showed up, practiced with dedication, and shared his wisdom with those willing to listen. Later, as the class wrapped up, Bryn approached George, intrigued by his teaching. She asked him why he came back to teaching after so many years. And George's response was simple yet profound. You can't carry something forever. At some point, you either pass it on or it turns to stone. His words resonated with Bryn, who was beginning to understand that martial arts wasn't just about learning how to fight. It was about learning how to be still, how to listen to your body, and how to grow beyond your limits. A few days later, George's influence continued to be felt in the dojo. Mark, who had been humbled by George's presence, approached him, asking for further guidance. George didn't hesitate to accept, teaching him not just how to fight, but how to move with purpose and calmness. Over time, George's quiet strength began to shape the dojo's culture, reminding everyone that true power comes from within and that sometimes the greatest lesson is knowing when to step back and let others rise. As George continued to teach, he understood that teaching was never about showing off, it was about being present, guiding others, and letting go when the time was right. And with each passing week, he saw his students grow, not just in skill, but in character, learning that martial arts was a journey of inner transformation as much as it was about physical mastery. The door to the karate dojo creaked open, and all eyes turned as a 74-year-old man, limping slightly as he walked in, stepped onto the mat. His name was Henry Marsh, an old man whose appearance, with his thick glasses and slight limp, hardly suggested anything extraordinary. His worn-out windbreaker clung to his thin frame, and the jingle of his keys seemed louder than usual. As he moved into the back corner of the room, setting his water bottle down and leaning his cane against the mirror, he observed the class in silence. Most of the students, young and full of energy, barely took notice of him. They were more focused on themselves, stretching, chatting, loosening up for the session. However, there was one girl, Lucy, who couldn't help but watch him with curiosity. She noticed his calm demeanor, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, despite the years of wear on his body. The class was led by Jake Mendez, who had been teaching the group for the past 6 months. The students were mostly in their teens or 20s, energetic and eager, with some having already formed opinions about the new guy before he even stepped on the mat. One of the students, Mark, was particularly vocal. At first, Mark sneered at Henry, muttering a comment about him possibly being there for Tai Chi instead of karate. This comment was met with a ripple of laughter. But Henry didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't comment. He simply stood in the back, observing, waiting. When the class started, he participated without complaint, kicking off his sneakers and stepping into a plain, faded gray t-shirt and black training pants, his frail body betraying nothing of the strength it had once held. As Jake led the group through front kicks, Henry quietly retrieved something from his bag, a black belt, frayed at both ends. The moment the belt wrapped around his waist, the energy in the room shifted. Without a word, Henry stepped forward and executed a perfect kick, the precision and sharpness of it stunning everyone. Even Jake, the students, especially Mark, who had been laughing earlier, were now silenced. The mocking was gone, replaced with awe. Henry didn't look for applause or acknowledgement. He simply returned to his spot and continued to practice, moving with a calm efficiency that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. Still, the room wasn't fully convinced. Jake, the instructor, continued leading the session, but the atmosphere had undeniably changed. It wasn't just the technique, it was Henry's presence, quiet, unassuming, yet profound. It wasn't long before Mark, who had initially mocked Henry, grew increasingly frustrated with his own inability to keep up with the old man's movements. When the class broke into pairs, Mark called out, challenging Henry, mocking him with a sarcastic, "Grandpa." But Henry remained unshaken. He stepped forward and calmly offered to spar with Mark, suggesting they test their skills in a safe, controlled manner. Mark, overconfident and eager to show off, jumped at the chance. They squared off, with Mark bouncing on his feet, ready to overwhelm Henry with speed and power. But Henry didn't move at first. He simply observed Mark, watching his every move, waiting for the right moment. Mark came in with a series of punches, each one faster and looser than the last. But Henry blocked them all with ease, his movements tight and controlled. The difference in skill was glaring. It wasn't that Henry was faster or stronger, it was that he was calm, measured, and completely in control of himself and his environment. Mark, on the other hand, was a bundle of raw energy, unrefined and flustered. The sparring session ended with Mark panting, his confidence shattered. Henry had barely broken a sweat. Without a word, he walked back to his bag, sipped his water, and waited for the next instruction. The tension in the room was palpable, as students tried to process what had just happened. No one had expected Henry to be so skilled, let alone so calm. He didn't need to prove anything. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. The session continued, but the students were no longer just going through the motions. They were paying attention, watching Henry, and learning in a way they hadn't anticipated. After class, Henry didn't rush to leave. He stayed behind, sitting quietly, and a few students approached him. Lucy, who had been intrigued by him since the beginning, asked him about his experience. Henry explained that he had been teaching for many years but had stopped for a long time after a personal tragedy. A student of his, a young man named Rico, had died trying to protect someone. He blamed himself for not teaching Rico enough to defend himself, and the guilt weighed on him for years. It wasn't until recently, with the encouragement of students like Lucy, that Henry realized he still had something to offer. He had learned that it wasn't the black belt that mattered. It was the journey to earn it. It wasn't just about teaching students how to fight. It was about teaching them how to live with discipline, how to stay calm when everything around them seemed chaotic, and how to learn from their mistakes instead of letting them define them. By the end of the session, Henry had not only imparted martial arts techniques but also the wisdom he had accumulated over his life. Mark, who had once mocked him, now approached Henry with respect, asking if he could learn from him. Henry didn't promise anything grand. He simply agreed to help him learn. Not to win, but to earn it. It was a quiet lesson in humility, patience, and the power of experience, one that would stay with the students long after they left the dojo. When the elderly man entered the karate class, the youthful energy in the room immediately shifted. His name was Henry Marsh, a 74-year-old with a history as deep as his years. But at first glance, he appeared like anyone's grandfather, with a slight limp and a worn windbreaker. He was an unassuming figure in a room full of young, eager martial artists. His glasses slid down his nose as he moved slowly, setting down his cane and water bottle in the back corner of the room. The 14 other students, most of whom were between 15 and 30 years old, barely noticed him as they stretched and chatted. But there was one comment, low enough not to be heard by the instructor, Jake, but loud enough for Henry to catch. "Is he here for Tai Chi or something?" sneered one student. Trevon, whose loud and confident demeanor was matched only by his arrogance. Henry didn't respond. His only action was a slow, deliberate walk to the corner of the room, setting down his things. The comment didn't faze him, nor did the sideways glances he caught from the other students. Instead, he stood still, observing. In his own time, he had learned the value of patience, stillness, and precision, lessons that had carried him through decades of martial arts and life. He kicked off his sneakers, tied his frayed black belt around his waist, and got to work. What happened next was nothing short of transformative. As the instructor demonstrated a front kick to the class, Henry quietly stepped forward and executed the same move with perfect form and flawless precision. It wasn't flashy or showy, it was just clean, controlled, and efficient. The room fell silent. Trevon, the loudest in the room just moments ago, now stood stunned, unable to muster his usual bravado. Henry's simple, calm execution of the move had rendered him speechless. What followed was a shift not just in the room but in the way the students viewed Henry. His calm and steady presence had silenced the room. But it wasn't just the kick that commanded attention, it was his entire demeanor. There was no need for a boastful display of skill or force. He was the embodiment of martial arts principles, control, calm, and efficiency. While the other students continued their drills, Henry remained off to the side, working through his own forms with subtlety and precision. A silent teacher in their midst. Trevon, whose earlier cockiness had turned into subtle frustration, kept stealing glances at Henry. His usual smirk was replaced by a growing respect, though he refused to admit it. He tried to continue with his drills, but his footwork was sloppy, his punches off balance. Meanwhile, the young girl, Bryn, a 16-year-old newcomer, was struggling to maintain her posture. Henry, ever observant, noticed her difficulty. Despite his own stiff joints, he slowly walked over to her, crouched beside her, and offered quiet guidance. "Your back heel is lifting too soon," he advised. "Press it down and let the energy come from your hip, not your toes." His words weren't just about technique, they were about teaching her to feel the movement, to connect with the power within her, instead of rushing through the motions. As Bryn tried again, her form improved. Though it wasn't perfect, she looked to Henry, almost sheepishly, for validation. "Did I do it right?" she asked. Henry nodded once, his expression calm and steady, offering nothing but approval. The moment was simple yet profound. He didn't need to show off or prove his superiority. He taught with quiet authority, letting his actions speak louder than any words could. The tension in the room was palpable as Trevon, frustrated by his own inability to perform at the level he had once boasted about, challenged Henry. "Old man, you ever teach, or do you just pull that belt out when someone's watching?" he called out. Some students chuckled, unsure of how to react. But Henry didn't flinch. He simply stepped toward Trevon and offered him a challenge. "You want to test something? We do it safe. We do it right." Trevon, eager to prove himself, accepted, and they squared off on the mat. What followed was a quiet demonstration of martial arts wisdom. Trevon's movements were fast and aggressive, but they were also reckless, while Henry moved with calm precision. Each of Trevon's strikes was deflected or avoided with minimal movement. Henry wasn't trying to overpower Trevon. He was teaching him to control his energy, to wait for the right moment instead of rushing. When the sparring session ended, Trevon was panting, his face flushed. Henry, barely winded, simply walked back to his bag, taking a sip of water, and offered no further words. By the end of the class, the students were no longer laughing. They weren't mocking Henry. Instead, they were watching him with a new kind of respect, one that came from witnessing his quiet mastery. Bryn, curious and eager to learn, approached him after class. They spoke about his life, his teaching, and the wisdom that he had gained through years of training and hardship. Henry explained that he had once taught full-time but had stopped after a tragedy involving one of his students, Rico, who had died protecting his cousin from gang violence. For years, Henry had carried the weight of guilt, believing he had failed Rico. But through his conversation with Bryn, he began to realize that the lessons he had imparted had meant more than he had ever understood. Henry returned the following week, and the respect for him only deepened. He didn't boast or push for recognition. Instead, he simply guided the students with quiet wisdom. Trevon, having learned the value of control and humility, sought Henry's guidance and admitted he wanted to learn not just how to fight but how to truly understand the art of martial arts. The class had shifted. It wasn't just about technique anymore. It was about the deeper lessons of patience, control, and learning to walk through life with a steady, grounded presence. By the end of the class, it was clear that Henry had not just taught martial arts. He had taught life lessons that would stick with his students forever. His quiet example had shown them that true strength doesn't come from power, but from knowing when to move and when to stay still, when to fight and when to let go. As he left that day, he left with the knowledge that his time to teach had come. Not because he sought it, but because someone had asked him to show up. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that sometimes the most powerful lessons are learned in silence. In a quiet martial arts dojo, an elderly man named Henry, at 74 years old, enters the room with a limp and a worn windbreaker. The young students, most of them in their teens or 20s, chuckle and glance at each other as they wonder if he's in the right class. But as Henry quietly wraps his faded black belt around his waist and moves with practiced precision, the room falls silent. His movements, though slow and deliberate, carry an undeniable power, as though each action was crafted over a lifetime of wisdom. He doesn't speak much, doesn't demand attention, yet in his calm presence, there's an undeniable strength. When one student, Trevon, challenges him, mocking his age and skill, Henry responds not with words, but with action. He invites Trevon to test him on the mat, and as they spar, Trevon's once overconfident, aggressive style is easily outmaneuvered by Henry's calm, calculated movements. The students, once doubtful, are now watching in awe, realizing that true strength doesn't come from youthful energy or loud displays of power. It comes from patience, discipline, and the ability to remain calm, even when faced with a challenge. After the class, Henry quietly shares a profound truth with a young girl named Bryn. He tells her that the lessons he's learned in life go beyond physical technique. Life, he says, teaches us through pressure, pain, and silence. Sometimes, the hardest part of life is knowing when to let go of guilt, when to forgive ourselves for the things we cannot control, and when to stop trying to prove ourselves. The weight of years, mistakes, and regrets can only be released when we stop carrying it on our shoulders. Henry's story of guilt, loss, and redemption teaches Bryn, and the other students, that our greatest battles aren't always fought with our fists, but with our minds, our hearts, and the way we carry ourselves through the world. This lesson of quiet strength resonates deeply. Henry's journey through guilt and redemption isn't just about martial arts, It's about life itself. It's about realizing that sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from the loudest voices, but from the stillest moments. And just like Henry, we all have the power to show up, even when we feel like we have nothing left to give. It's not about how hard we hit or how fast we move. It's about knowing when to stand still, when to let go, and when to pass on what we've learned. If Henry's story touched your heart, I encourage you to leave a comment and share your thoughts. How do you carry your burdens? And what have you learned about letting go? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the real strength that lives in all of us.